what is empowering about joy and playfulness?
Yeah, well, first off, I think it's empowering that you use the word joy and not happiness. I think that in of itself is a fantastic word switch, which then switches our mindset. And here's the reason I think that is because a lot of times and again, this is research driven, when we pursue happiness, we end up more unhappy. We end up more frustrated because often our definitions or our criteria of happiness are socially or culturally driven. We think we'd be happy in a certain relationship or a certain job or a certain status. And those ultimately are socially prescribed values and not necessarily our own, pursuing them simply because that's what you quote should do, or that's the next step in life, and so on. It often results in the sense of malaise, this kind of meh feeling. That's not a
Yeah.
scientific
Hmm.
word, but we've all felt that. You're like, I've done these things, but yet I just don't feel fulfilled. And I think joy is the other side of the coin, and I think that's the piece here that we want to focus on, is what is meaningful for you. And I love that you use the word joy, because that's what I talk about with my clients. I'll say to them, let's create a joy activity every day.
Do you remember what it feels like to be comfortable in your own skin? Not just confident, but also pain-free, relaxed, healthy, and carefree. Think about the most robust version of your own childhood body. This is what lifeyness feels like: a joyful spirit and a vibrant physical state of being. I'm your guide, Professor Sarah, storyteller, teacher, and wellness enthusiast. Reach into the vitality of your own girlhood to supercharge your grown-up life.
Hey, welcome back to Lifeyness. Today, I'm talking to Tracy Packiam Alloway, and we're going to take a close look at the elements of lifeyness together. Joy, playfulness, embodiment, even gratitude, and apply them to Tracy's field of research. So she's going to help provide a little scientific grounding for many of the things that you as listeners probably already know intuitively. So first, we're going to speak about being playful and how that can actually lead to a sense of empowerment. And then Tracy offers some techniques on calming the nervous system, relaxing, but not just necessarily traditional relaxation techniques. So she explains how sometimes it's more important to burn off adrenaline or nervous energy in what she calls proprioceptively dynamic exercises versus calming exercises like yoga. And don't worry, she's going to explain what that means. Then we're going to go on, we discussed trauma-informed healing a little bit, which ties into an exciting upcoming episode based on Peter Levine's work that's going to be in a couple weeks about somatic experiencing. We also talk about one of Tracy's most dynamic areas of research, and that is how the female brain sometimes operates differently from men's brains. That can be found in her book, Think Like a Girl. And lastly, she's going to touch on some of the new research she's doing, which is really exciting, about joyfulness and happiness and how to kind of measure that in the lab. So that's a little preview of what we're going to cover. And I want to share a couple minutes of thoughts with you that I had right after I recorded the interview with her. So we'll do that, and then I'll give her a proper introduction. Thanks for joining me today, and be sure to follow me at Book of Lifeyness on Instagram. So I'm sitting here right after interviewing Tracy Alloway, and I am just thinking how expansive life is. That's how it feels after talking to someone like Tracy, because I feel like I have had the privilege to do a lot of things this year. I've been on sabbatical, and it's kind of coming towards the end, and I'm going to go back to classes in the fall. But in this year, I have been able to try out a lot of different things. I've been able to relax. I've been able to play and do all the things that I love, that I feel are embodied in lifeyness, in the concept of lifeyness. But when I talk to somebody like Tracy, I feel like there are so many ways to be, meaning just the fact that she is so prolific, right? She's an academic. She writes all these books, but she's also this open, wonderful, joyful person. She's a great speaker. She's a great teacher. She's a great researcher. But she also has time to play and new ways of, interacting in life that I have never thought of. Not that I think of everything, but I feel like I have this amazing, wonderful, dynamic life where I can try different things. And I've been able to do some traveling this year, some new kinds of working out, new kinds of relating, new kinds of loving the different people in my life. And yet she had so much to teach me in one short interview. And one of those things was we talked about animal movement, kind of using animal moves in working out and being more playful. And she says that she does some trapeze work in order to kind of stay playful and also stay mindful. And it just made me realize that there is not one way to be. Like we talked about mentoring younger women. If there's anything I can tell young people just in general is that you don't have to limit your life to one way of being. It can change. You can change it, but also things can come to you that will change the way that you see life altogether. Meaning, if you see kind of a dark path, if you are in a dark space, kind of moving through that and staying with it, but not feeling like this is all that life is, or if you're on a plateau or just kind of in a boring space, I have found that life kind of surprises you and that there are new ways of being all the time that I'm discovering. So I hope you enjoy this interview with Tracy Alloway. She is an amazing neuropsychologist, researcher. She's a faculty member here in Jacksonville at the University of North Florida. She has been doing some amazing research for the past several years. Currently, she's working on doing brain scans and measuring happiness, kind of where the brain lights up on her scale of joy and happiness. She has a book that just came out in 2021 called Think Like a Girl. I highly recommend that. Very fun and interesting book, which is exactly how I would describe Tracy. Fun and interesting, so smart, so prolific in her writing. She was a speaker of mine when I was a speaker coach with the TEDx Jacksonville conference back in 2016. And since then, she did a talk about social media and the brain and working memory. And since then, she has just become even more of a giant in her field and, continues to publish. And she has this incredible energy about her. So welcome, Tracy Alloway, to the show. Thank you for joining me. Since you have, you've just published this book about the female brain, and I say just, but I think it was a couple years ago, right? 2021? Think Like a Girl. It's wonderful. Yes. It's so exciting. And I haven't finished it, but it's a great book. In what ways does the female brain thrive in this more playful environment?
Yeah, I would say there are two ways in which the female brain thrives. I love the word that you used there, the word thrives when it comes to the female brain. And the first is that we are very creative and we often think very differently too, but sometimes our creativity is not recognized because more objective measures, and by objective, I mean those that show up in a scientifically published paper or research world, tend to be very male dominated. So they tend to look more at creativity in a very physical or athletic space or a very leadership type of role. And so we kind of miss the opportunity to celebrate some of the ways in which the female brain does thrive, as you put it, in a very playful way. So we are very divergent thinkers. And so, for those of you who might be aware of that, we tend not to, we can accommodate different areas, different expertise simultaneously. And this is borne out in brain imaging studies where we see brain activation in different parts of the brain when given a problem to solve. So we're not hyper-focused. And again, I want to preface all of this by saying none of this is good or bad. I prefer not to use those kinds of labels. It just is descriptive. It's not a value judgment on the way in which our brain works or doesn't work. But one of the things it's important to recognize and embrace is that when given a problem, we're going to pull from different levels of experience. We could pull from our language brain. What are we thinking? How can we think through the solution? We could pull from our long-term memory, our hippocampus. Where have I seen this kind of problem before? How can I use this? We could pull from our visual brain. Hey, I think I can use a maybe visually creative solution. And so I think it's that recognition that just because we're not solving a problem in a linear way does not negate the creative process in which we're thriving. And so one way that you can foster this, and again, this is research driven, and it's something I talk about in my book. I actually got to interview an amazing female comedian. We often don't think, now I think the tide is changing, but at the time which I was writing the book, there were far fewer female comedians that were, sharing the stage with their male counterparts. And humor wasn't one of the attributes that were pulled up in a large scale study when you think of females. And so some ways we can foster this is just even having the ability to walk away from the ideas. So one of the things sometimes with females, we can also get really focused on solving a problem, or we feel so motivated to solve a problem that we don't disengage, and sometimes to our detriment. And this goes counter to how the brain works. So the creative brain actually taps what's called the subconscious brain, or, it's the default mode network is the actual part of the brain, but that's known as the subconscious, or the sense of self, your self-expression part of the brain. And when we have our thinking brain so dialed up, it actually mutes the self-expression part of our brain, our self-identity, this creative brain. So sometimes, you may notice that these ideas come to you when you're least expecting it, when you're going on a run, when you're walking, when you're doing something completely unrelated. And that's because your thinking brain is engaged in something else, and it allows that creative, that self-expression brain to rise to the forefront. And so for yourself, you can be intentional. You can say, okay, I'm intentionally not going to think about this problem right now. I'm going to do something completely unrelated, something physical even, again, it's walking or something that you enjoy doing. And you'll notice that creative brain come into play. And so that's one way that we can kind of foster that. Another way that women thrive in this playful lifeyness environment that is the theme of the podcast is we're very nurturing, and sometimes this is viewed by society or culturally as a weakness. This plays out in the workplace, and I talk about this in the book too, where we can have what some people have termed as ruinous empathy. We are so hesitant to maybe provide constructive feedback because we're so concerned about, well, how will that person take it? Will they view it so negatively? What will they think of me? Will they not like me as much because I'm giving them feedback? And this is this idea of ruinous empathy, where we're so empathetic to our listeners' feelings that it can be ruinful. We can take away the opportunity for growth in that person, as well as growth in ourselves as a leader. But also we look at decision making in females, and we tend to be very nurture driven. So one example is the trolley dilemma. Some of your listeners may have heard about this. It's a very popular philosophical debate. It's made its way into some mainstream TV shows as well.
Yes, it has. I love The Good Place.
Yes, exactly. And the premise is straightforward. You are an observer, and you see a train is hurtling towards you, and it's going to injure either 5 people or 1 person. Now, you have the ability to kind of save the day, as it will, by switching the track the train is on and saving those 5 people, but it will injure 1 other person. And the dilemma is phrased far more high stakes, where it'll actually end their life. And so a lot of times women will opt not to. They don't even want to make a decision. And this has been perceived as a weakness. And from my own research and others as well that have used this dilemma in a psychological setting, we find that this is motivated by a need to protect. That women, their instinct is to nurture, is to protect. And so they're going to say, I can't even make a decision and that could result in the harm of even one person. And so they step away from that kind of utilitarian decision making, greater good for the greater number of people,
Right.
because of this need to protect. And again, this can be viewed as a weakness socially, but I think as women, we should embrace that. This is really powerful, really nurturing, and be able to acknowledge that and think of how it can work in the setting that we're in.
Yeah, that's great. You seem to emphasize the word protect. We always hear nurture, but I love that the word protect, we think of like fathers and men as protectors, but I think essentially that's what we're doing, right? We're trying to protect, if it's an injured animal or, the neighbor's kid, we're looking out for everybody, right? We want to protect our society, right? So yeah, that's wonderful. I want to move from playfulness to kind of this relaxation. And are there any methods that you use for relaxation and for kind of like getting connected, mind and body connected so that you can relax?
Yeah, I think my personal routine is grounding based. And I love that you talk about the mind body connection. Sometimes we are so dissociated that we don't recognize the impact of our brain, our anxiety on our physical self, or vice versa. And, anxiety is a good example of that, where it can be an adaptive. We also think of anxiety as negative a lot of times, and it can certainly be a maladaptive form where it paralyzes us from decision making, from any kind of behavior that could be healthy. But on the other side, it could be adaptive, that anxiety may be like a soft alarm system, like, hey, it would be good to be proactive. How can we prepare for this situation?
Right.
What can we do to circumvent any potential threat? But part of that in the physiological sense is the body releases adrenaline in anticipation for that fight flight environment. And so a lot of times, as a licensed psychologist, a client will tell me, oh, I'm edgy. I have to move. I can't, when I'm nervous, I'm always doing something. I'm either, picking at my nails or I'm moving around, fidgeting, and that's that adrenaline. And so rather than feeling like you have to suppress that, I would suggest do something physical to use that adrenaline. Maybe those are jumping jacks. Maybe those are, whatever works for you. Maybe pace as you're making that important phone call that you feel nervous about. But using that adrenaline, and also what it does is it frees up the front of your brain that is you're using that space to manage that anxiety. And when you allow yourself, you know what? I'm just going to acknowledge I do feel anxious, but what can I do? What's my proactive solution here? And so for me, your question was me personally, I enjoyed the grounding exercise. I love running barefoot on the beach. And my own research has shown that it improves working memory, which is the front of the brain. And for me, I find the whole activity very calming because it is an opportunity for me just to be very present focused. Another activity that I do when I'm feeling overwhelmed is trapeze. It's an aerial activity. And people have talked about this in the context of something like jujitsu, for example. And they're different physical activities, but what they have in common is that they require you to be cognitively so present in the moment. You have to be thinking, where's my body in this space right now? Where are my hands? Where are my feet? Or you could injure yourself. And to some extent, I did a research study with something called MoveNat, which uses those same principles. You're balancing, and these are simple things that you do. Imagine yourself at a playground, and you're kind of walking a little bit of that elevated balance beam that surrounds a sand or something. Maybe you're on the monkey bars, with your child. All of those are very you're physically involved, but you have to use those cognitive skills, or you may lose your balance. You may, let go of your hand. And the word that I used in that research study is called proprioceptively dynamic. Proprioception, as some of your listeners may be aware, is the body's aware in space. So where am I? Where am I standing? Am I in balance? Like, am I going to slide? Am I going to slip? That's proprioception. And in that particular research, I compared the dynamic piece of the movement. I'm actually moving versus static proprioception. So a calming yoga, and again, yoga has tremendous benefits for mental health, but I wanted to kind of look at it from a different angle. What are the cognitive benefits? And I found that something that's proprioceptively dynamic. So for me, that's an aerial activity. For others, it may be joining your child in the playground. It could be something else, that you are constantly engaged while you're moving and being aware of your body in space. But that is a great way to manage the anxiety, as well as to give your brain a little, cognitive boost.
Yeah.
We found significant improvements just after a short time of doing those activities.
I love that. That's like staying in the present moment, being
Mm.
playful, and it's kind of in embodying yourself, proprioception. I like that. And I think you use the term MoveNet. What, MoveNet?
Yeah, it's a an organization.
Okay.
I think it's a nonprofit that they encourage people to play outside, very similar to the
Mm.
podcast, to be playful, to kind of move away from these very structured, prescribed activities and just let yourself play in a way that feels organic to how you are.
Oh, I love that. I have to look into that. Wow. Recently, I've started doing some exercise that incorporates animal movements. Um,
Yes, yes.
I do you know about this? Yeah, it's so
Yes.
fun.
And so movement has a lot of overlap with the kind of animal movement theme, that playfulness, and the
Yeah.
perceptively dynamic movements that you see in animal movements.
Wonderful. Wonderful. I can't wait to look into that. So yeah, I wanted to talk a little bit about that. Peter Levine has talked about, kind of coming back into the body and being able to kind of deal with those feelings, for somebody who has experienced trauma. It sometimes doesn't feel good. With my last guest, I talked about that. She does Koya, which is a kind of a playful kind of dance. She's a Koya instructor, and she talks about sometimes embodiment doesn't feel good. And
Yeah.
that is true for, people who are maybe suffering from pain or
Mhm.
who are dealing with trauma and kind of coming back into their bodies. Do you
Yeah.
have any, do you have any experience with this kind of research?
Yeah, both. I do a lot of work with veterans, who are
Mm.
struggling with PTSD or other mental health related issues, trauma related. And again, the research here is really powerful. One, as you rightly pointed out, we hold a lot of trauma in our body. So we notice, maybe tension headaches, pain in the shoulders, stomach upset that may not have a direct physiological explanation. And that's because it's trauma based or anxiety based. And so there are a couple of things that we can do in what we call the sort of everyday traumas. Maybe we have an experience of severe trauma, which, would require a trained therapist to work through that. But even just daily traumas, a couple things from research that I use in my practice is one, using the word stop. And I have that physical gesture too. And it's almost like reverse engineering the process. So our brain informs our body, and we're very familiar with this. So when we're stressed, we notice our shoulders hunch, we kind of lean down, where, we feel internal. We may notice ourselves crouching in when we're feeling stressed in a protective way. Maybe it's not intentional. Oftentimes it's not intentional, but your body does that automatically. Like, oh, I got to close in. I got to protect everything. Well, equally, we can reverse engineer the process. So when you're feeling, especially with women, and I talk about this in the chapter on happiness and mental health, our neurotransmitters make us more prone to overthinking or ruminative thoughts. It's not deterministic, but it's something to be aware of, that we are more susceptible. And one of a fantastic piece of research, and one that I do in my everyday life too, is just even allowing myself, first of all, a timer. Like I may set a timer for 5 minutes, say all the things I'm anxious or angry or sad about, that negative emotion. No apology, no caveats. I just say it. I say the emotion. I let it just exist. But when my timer is done, I turn it off. I say stop, like we're done. And the physical gesture here is really important, because that physical gesture is communicating to the brain, this is my boundary. We're done. We're done thinking about it. And here's what I'm going to do next. Where's my proaction line?
Mm-hmm.
All right, I'm angry. Here's what I'm going to do about it. I'm going to have a conversation, or I'm going to do nothing. That's still an action. But
Yeah.
feeling that focus of control, that agency, that things are not just happening to me, but that I am an agent in this situation right now. If I'm sad, what am I going to do? Well, what is one thing I can, control, I can be in charge of? But that stop, that physical gesture is really important. Another physical gesture that I do and I suggest to my clients is even writing it down, maybe writing that negative emotion down and then crumpling it up and physically throwing it away. So again, it's very visceral, it's very physical, and it communicates to the brain, this is it, I'm done with this emotion for right now. I don't need to have this permeate like a kind of drizzle throughout my entire day.
I love that. That is a great idea. That's wonderful, because you're doing something about it, you're dealing with it, but you're addressing it head on, and then you're drawing a boundary.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, boundaries are wonderful. So I wanted to know how, just with you studying the differences between kind of a male and female brain, what you've learned about the differences of the impact of stress on the body or on the brain. Perhaps like how does soothing the nervous system support even more so, the female brain? And what are maybe the differences between stress on the body when it comes to, differences in gender?
Such a great question. And that type of question really motivated the reason why I wrote the book to begin with, because a lot of times research in general is very broad brushstroke, it's kind of generic. Well, these are general patterns rather than tailored to the unique ways in which our brain works. And so stress is a great example of that, where again, typically speaking, the male brain tends to respond in that fight, flight, sometimes freeze, but a more fight, flight, adrenaline-driven response. In contrast, the female brain tends to respond in what researchers call the tend and befriend approach. So while adrenaline is part of that, we also seek oxytocin. We seek social support to manage our stress. And that may be why, as women, our first instinct in a moment of stress is to text someone, to call someone, to say, who can I need my girls, I need someone around me just to kind of lift me up. I need a hype person. And it's knowing that can help you address that, in those moments of stress, rather than isolating yourself. Be intentional. Text someone who is that positive, optimistic person who's a good listener, if that's what you need in that. Or someone that'll say, hey, let's forget about it. Let's go out and have a good time. What do you need in that moment? And recognizing that the female response to stress is tend and befriend. We want that social connection. Our brains need that. Again, that oxytocin is that bonding hormone, that social connection hormone. And that's what we're seeking in those moments of stress. So again, if your default is maybe just to isolate and you think I can't be around people, that's okay. At least use a text. At least just say, hey, I need to reach out. I just need you. I need to know you're there at the very minimum. And if you feel you're not ready for a full conversation, but recognizing that, acknowledging that, and then knowing how you can use those friendships in a positive and uplifting way is really important.
I've never even heard tend and befriend. That's so interesting. But sometimes you go towards that person who may not be safe, but since you want to reach out and connect, then you're going back to the, the bad person or the person who doesn't support you. So I can see how people kind of get into those cycles. That's really interesting.
And I think back to this idea of proaction, one way to manage that is, I call it create a menu item. So prepare for that ahead of time by listing people that would be healthy and supportive in those environments. And so in those moments of stress where you're really not in a mental state to manage, who do I need to talk to right now? You don't have to. You open your phone, you look at the notes you created, say, Cece, great for sending a text right away. Very responsive. That's who I'm going to text right now. Jane, always available when I say, hey, I need to just hang out and just be. Great. Let's do that. This person, maybe not so much, going to give me, or maybe you're looking
stress.
For but
more stress.
Maybe they use you as their support system, and that's what you're able to offer. So having that written down for yourself in those moments of stress is really helpful. So you don't really
love that.
like, who do I need in this moment? You already have that lookup guide for yourself.
Yeah. I think I already have. I know exactly off the top of my head who I would call, but I haven't been intentional about it. So that's wonderful. I love that. I've also heard the word tonic immobility, where you freeze when you're, faced with a really stressful situation, which I know that I do that sometimes as well. Just kind of don't do anything, which can be bad. I mean, I guess sometimes you just need that. You need to just kind of stop.
No, and this is this idea of, the freeze response that we talked about as a stress response. And I think here, part of the therapy that I use with my clients is something called dialectic behavior therapy, or DBT. Yes. And it's this idea of one of the principles of DBT is radical acceptance. And it's accepting that, right now I am frozen. I accept that. I'm okay with that. So sometimes we bring in judgment, we bring in guilt, we bring in shame. Sometimes those are socially prescribed. Sometimes, we're like, oh, well, if you're not constantly productive, if you're not, on the grind or hustling all the time, then you're not going to be successful. So we create these dichotomous positions that we're either, all or nothing. And as a result, when we are in those moments of freeze or tonic immobility, as you shared, we feel guilty. We feel like I can't, if I'm in this position, then I'm not living up to social or cultural society standards of productivity or girl boss or all these labels that we hear. Right. And so I think the first step is just recognizing and accepting, right now I am frozen. It's okay, I accept that. But I also acknowledge that it's not a forever, it's a right now. And that's another phrase that I use a lot in my practice, that right now I'm frozen. And again, it's a study of boundaries. It creates a space that in the present I'm frozen. That doesn't mean that in the next hour I'm going to be frozen, or the next day or the next week. I can anticipate, I can be proactive, but right now I'll just take a moment, be frozen, not judge myself for that, not put guilt or shame on myself for that, but recognize that I'm going to create a boundary too. I'll give myself 30 minutes of, frozenness or tonic immobility, and then I'll come up with the decision.
Yeah, that's great. We're drawing those boundaries again. Okay, so what I want to talk about a little bit is sometimes we don't connect like joy and empowerment, right? Like there's empowerment, there's like independent woman, and that's a serious woman, right? But how can we connect like joy and resilience, which is always important, when you're, especially when you're raising children, we talk about resilience. But how can we connect joy and empowerment for women? Like, do you think that maybe embracing this more playful spirit could somehow contribute to like uplifting families, communities, being a more playful mother? I know that I've always incorporated that into my parenthood, but how can we, I don't know, make this a little bit more official? What is empowering about joy and playfulness?
Yeah, well, first off, I think it's empowering that you use the word joy and not happiness. I think that in of itself is a fantastic word switch, which then switches our mindset. And here's the reason I think that is because a lot of times and again, this is research driven, when we pursue happiness, we end up more unhappy. We end up more frustrated because often our definitions or our criteria of happiness are socially or culturally driven. We think we'd be happy in a certain relationship or a certain job or a certain status. And those ultimately are socially prescribed values and not necessarily our own. Again, back to this idea of agency, we haven't created those values for ourselves. If you have, that's wonderful. That may indeed be a source of happiness for you. But if you haven't, you're pursuing them simply because that's what you quote should do, or that's the next step in life and so on, it often results in the sense of malaise, this kind of meh feeling, that's not a scientific word, but we've all felt that. You're like, I've done these things, but yet I just don't feel fulfilled. And oftentimes it's because it's pursuing happiness that is not driven by our own sense of agency. We haven't created those goals. And I think joy is the other side of the coin. It's a mindset. We are choosing what to create meaning. And I think that's the piece here that we want to focus on, is what is meaningful for you. And I love that you use the word joy, because that's what I talk about with my clients. I'll say to them, let's create a joy activity every day. It doesn't have to be big. It could be something that you feel brings you meaning to your day. Maybe that's your favorite walking trail. Maybe that's your favorite coffee place. Maybe that's just your favorite 5 minutes of a podcast or a song that brings you joy. But be intentional in creating an activity that is meaningful for you. And I think that is that mindset switch, that we're not seeking an emotion. We are creating an activity that is meaningful, and joy is the byproduct of that. Pursuing that activity. And so I think that results in us being playful, because we can be creative. You know what would be meaningful would be, to do these animal movements for 10 minutes in my living room. To kind of play with my cat or my pet for 5 or 10 minutes. Like, we'll give ourselves space to be playful, to be creative, and that ultimately brings us joy. So I think switching the focus, whether it's in parenting, whether it's just in your own mental health or your own self-care, or even in your friendships or your relationships, what activity can you be intentional about that does bring you meaning, that will ultimately bring you joy?
Wonderful. That is so great. Yeah. That's a great answer. So as a role model yourself, I like to think about, mentors and mentees, right? Like I feel like I'm at this stage in my life and you are as well. Like you can be this wonderful mentor, but you also have your own children. What have you learned, maybe from a mentor, and what do you hope to teach to, your children and, other mentees that you have, your students, about joyfulness and about play, kind of in everyday life, help
Yeah.
them kind of get by and just be more productive. Yes, like more productive and kind of more successful, but also with that element of joy that we're talking about.
Yeah, such a great question. I have, as a parent, I have two boys, but with my nieces, I see such a difference in how they're raised versus, I was raised. And I would say the one word I would suggest as a takeaway is agency, that you have a choice. It ties into this, not only boundary setting, but people pleasing, as women, especially culturally and socially. Culturally, for me, growing up in an Asian family, your goal is to say yes. Your goal is to, as a child, especially, not argue, not talk back, not express, and my parents were great in letting me be independent, but ultimately culturally too, there are these views that as women, we want to make sure everyone is comfortable. We want to do all these things for other people, and oftentimes at the detriment of our own mental health. And so what I try to practice, and what I recommend in my practice as a therapist too, is just doing a quick check. Ask yourself, is this what I want to do? Simple as that. And if the outcome, it could be, someone's asked you for coffee and it's your first, I call it the shoulder check. When you get that text, if your first response is, not me, and then maybe that's your body's way. Back to this embodiment idea. It's your body's way of telling your brain, I really, for whatever the reason, it doesn't matter. The reason's irrelevant. Ultimately, it's not a joyful activity. Back to this idea that it's not a joyful activity and it's okay to say no. And we can say it in a respectful, polite, loving way, but we don't have to say yes just to be a people pleaser. And that's where that agency comes in. You do have that choice. And if you're not aware of that, I suggest using this in small situations, zero to low stake situations. Asking yourself when you wake up, do I want to have a coffee this morning? Yes, great. Okay. You've made a decision. You're starting to be in tune with your needs right now. What do I want to wear? The blue or the green? Okay, I'm making a choice right now. What would make me happy to wear? It sounds so simple, but what it does is it creates a habit cognitively about you expressing agency. So in that moment where it is maybe larger stakes and someone says, hey, can you do this? You could say, I would really love to assist on this, but right now it's a very busy time. I can offer an alternative where I can do it then. But you can see the shift happening where you recognize as an individual, it's okay to say no. It's okay to set those boundaries. You have agency to determine, is this a healthy expression for me right now? And you can say no to that. And I think it's really powerful as females especially, and I say that especially because culturally it's not encouraged that we say no. And also our instinct is to be communal, to make sure everyone is comfortable. So we have a couple things, that we're maybe more susceptible to. So just even being intentional and recognizing that. And I think what it does ultimately on the other end of that decision-making is it can minimize a lot of resentment. If you say yes to something and you didn't want to do it, well, that's on you. You said yes. I said yes to that activity, even if I said, I have so much going on. I didn't really want to do X. I chose to say yes. That's on me, not on the person that's asking me. They have, they have a right to ask. Equally, I have a right to say no. But if I say no, if I say yes, and I'm like, the outcome wasn't great, I can remind myself, I said yes to that. It didn't turn out the way, but that's okay. I said yes. I'm not going to be resentful of that social connection because that was my decision. And so it can, create a little smoothness in that social connection in our friendships as well, where you're not even subconsciously or indirectly blaming them. You're not the person that's saying, they're always asking for this. Yeah, well, you don't have to say yes to all their asks. That's my responsibility to be an agent of my decisions.
Boundaries can change your life. I swear. It's such a great thing. And agency. I love that. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, that is wonderful because it's so true. Yeah, if you're not taking responsibility for your decisions and you're putting it on somebody else, there's going to be that resentment there, and it just gets sticky, right? And it it changes your life when you start being clear about things and you
Sure.
learn to say no. That is wonderful. And we've covered so much in such a short period that I want to wrap up and, use your time well, because I'm so happy that you're here and kind of like supporting some of these ideas with this research, with all of the research you've done. So this is just such a gift. So thank you. But I want you to tell me about any maybe upcoming projects or publications. You've written this wonderful book called Think Like a Girl. That's something that I think, I definitely want listeners to check out, and I'll put in the show notes. But are there any other, I don't know, upcoming projects or exciting research you're doing that you want to share?
Yeah, I am actually right. This very week, we started doing some neuroimaging research. It's really fun. I've created a happiness scale. So kind of like, what is your happiness personality? What is your joy personality? So like a love languages, but instead of having this generic understanding of what makes us happy, I really wanted to look a bit more from a research perspective. What are the things that you as an individual pursue that brings you joy, that brings you that, positive mental health? And so I've created a survey for that to identify that, and I'm matching it up with brain imaging. So when individuals are, have that little that you see on with little nodes attached to the brain, I want to know what excites them, what part of the brain is being activated as they think about agency, as they think about gratitude or optimism or social connectedness. Like, what brings that specific person that joy, and how does that map up to what they're seeking? So we can have a bit more tailored understanding of it as an individual. What can we be intentional about to create our joy?
That is exciting.
Thank you. I'm excited too.
Yeah. And you are incredibly prolific. I am so in awe of all of the work you've done. So it's amazing. But yeah, that's really cool. So are you going to be publishing that research?
Yeah, the goal is we're collecting data right now. So the goal is to, get to a certain number of participants so it's robust. And in the fall, we'd like to be analyzing and writing up the data.
Wonderful. Exciting. Well, it's been wonderful talking to you and catching up with you a little bit, Tracy. Thank you for joining me. And thank you for, like I said, bringing the research to lifeyness, bringing it to the joyful embodiment. But you're you're the neuropsychologist. And so there are so many things that I kind of had a feeling that you could affirm and kind of support, but it's been wonderful to hear you share your research.
It was such a pleasure seeing you, Sarah, and what a fun morning talking about these ideas. So thank you.